So let's get it started. So are you ready, Corey?
Sure.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the AGT Solid Professional Development Series. I am Madhu Kesi, your host for today. It's really great to have you all join us from different parts of the country. Um, the title of today's webinar is Three Languages, Many Multilingualisms, Pitfalls and Promises of Trilingual Education from a Suburban Arizona School. This is a wonderful study that Corey, conducted, for his doctoral degree here at ASU, Arizona State University. As you all know, that this webinar aims to provide various workshops and talks as part of professional development opportunities for AGTSOL members and also to the public. So let me briefly introduce our guest speaker for today's webinar. Corey Bogban is a 2024 graduate in educational policy and evaluation from the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. He has taught undergraduate and graduate courses with by multilingual teachers and administrators on educational language policy, family community engagement, and critical qualitative and quantitative research methods. Dr. Bogban is the program analyst and coordinator for the STEM Center of Excellence at Estrella Mountain Community College in Avondale, Arizona. And in this role, he conducts applied research and program evaluation to strengthen and institutionalize the college co-curricular STEM career development programs. So let me share a little bit about the format and structure of the webinar. Dr. Bergman will present his session for about 40 to 45 minutes. Then we'll have a time for a 15 to 20 minutes Q&A session towards the end of the session. So if you'd like to ask questions, please use the chat to submit your questions. As I already said, this webinar is going to be recorded and will later be available on the AGT Solo Web YouTube channel. Now, let's welcome Dr. Corey Bergman to deliver his session. So over to you, Dr. Bergman.
Thank you very much, Madhu. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share with everyone some of the takeaways from my dissertation study here in Arizona. So this talk is titled Three Languages, Many Multilingualisms, Pitfalls and Promises of Trilingual Education from a Suburban Arizona School. So I'll begin by briefly describing the background of trilingual education in Arizona and across the globe. I'll then move to discuss the study's equity-centered theoretical framework and briefly touch on the methods used to analyze the range of data which was collected and generated from this ethnographic study. Next, we'll look at select pieces of qualitative data to explore the meanings and values that diverse actors associate with different languages and language communities at this trilingual school. As we discuss some of the key takeaways from the study's findings, I've framed these as particular pitfalls or barriers or obstacles to equity, as well as promises, which are conduits to equity or promising and hopeful outcomes of the study, which will then connect to implications for policy and practice at multiple scales. First, it's important to begin by acknowledging my various intersecting identities as a person whose life has been shaped by vectors of privilege as well as marginalization. These identities all contribute to my own ways of being, of knowing, of making sense of the world. They're also selectively seen by others, and they don't always exist out of my own subjective sense of self. My critical reflexivity guides me to recognize how my intersecting identities place me in a unique subject position to conduct educational research with multilingual learners, teachers, and families. So some socio-historical background. Bilingual education in Arizona has been characterized by issues of access and equity for minoritized learners due to restrictive language policy and ideology. Among other concerns, this includes students labeled as English learners being restricted from accessing bilingual schools and receiving equitable attention and instruction from educators in both monolingual and bilingual schools. So guided by larger social and political forces, bilingual schooling has shifted over the last several decades to prioritize white and English privileged students and families over those who primarily use other languages at home. This trend has been described as the expropriation or gentrification of bilingual education, where educational resources, opportunities, and rights are dispossessed for the benefit of white and English privileged populations. Language minoritized communities are often excluded from accessing these distinct or prestigious resources and opportunities. Belying this trend, the number of schools with bilingual or multilingual programs in Maricopa County, Arizona, shot up from 22 in 2014 to 44 schools in 2022. Most of the new schools opened in areas with predominantly white or Asian and English privileged populations. In Arizona, the US, and really at a global scale, we're seeing how neoliberalism and market-based logics are reshaping how people view and design bilingual and trilingual education programs. Scholars have identified a discursive shift away from the term bilingual, which has historically connotated racialized heritage speakers of non-English languages, at least in the US context, shifting to terms like dual language immersion or multilingual immersion, which do not necessarily signal the presence of those students in these programs. And neoliberal market-oriented values align multilingual education in globally relevant, standardized languages with increased economic, social, and academic benefits or capital. There's minimal emphasis on sustaining minoritized students' heritage languages and their connections to marginalized racial, ethnic, linguistic, cultural heritages, or developing a sense of pride through their heritage language learning. Now, these schools do exist. Teachers, administrators are doing these things and supporting students, but actively centering those values and ensuring fidelity with their implementation is not necessarily the trend that we're seeing in bilingual education. So pressures from neoliberal societal discourses and education policies can lead schools with bi and multilingual programs to disregard or overlook access and equity concerns for racially, linguistically, and socioeconomically minoritized students and families. Further, in the US, bilingual education has historically been characterized by a subtractive approach that limited students' non-English home languages to be used as a tool to promote their English acquisition, and these heritage languages were not sustained as resources or assets for bilingual students. This trend has become more asset-oriented over the years, but the subtractive view still persists in many spaces. Trilingual education, on the other hand, is often framed around an additive lens where all three languages are seen as valuable resources for students to develop. However, even though three languages are being valued, they're often still viewed through a monoglossic lens, with each language functioning for different purposes and in distinct contexts. The models and goals used by trilingual programs vary based on their sociolinguistic context. However, the key elements of trilingual education can be gleaned from some of these foundational texts and others. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are some of the foundational or impactful pieces of literature that really shaped how I theorize kind of trilingual education in earlier formulations, right? Like the 1980s, 1990s, maybe early 2000s. Not to say that this era isn't characterized by neoliberal thinking, but what I noticed is that trilingual education is often described in a lot of these studies as being centered around minoritized language communities, with the goal of sustaining and revitalizing and enriching heritage languages. They're often created by top-down official language policies, and there's a lot of difficulties that stem from these policies' creation and implementation, especially in rural areas or areas that might not receive the same level of resources as maybe more urban spaces. Trilingual education is often usually framed around one or two colonial hegemonic languages, right? So English, Spanish, French, and then the inclusion of additional languages. There are several foundational studies of trilingual education from an indigenous language maintenance perspective here in Arizona with the Yaqui tribe in Guadalupe near modern day Tempe. And this tribe had trilingual schools to promote language and literacy in Spanish, English, and Yaqui, which is their indigenous language. So I wanted to acknowledge that these things are happening here in Arizona. They have historically been happening. A lot of trilingual education is framed as kind of beginning in Europe or beginning in Canada, but we know that indigenous communities have had their multilingual realities have been the way for generations. But in the neoliberal kind of times that we find ourselves in, trilingual education has largely come to cater to upwardly mobile, highly educated, higher socioeconomic status learners of two or more internationally useful languages. Usually, saying two or more, this implies that these learners have most likely already learned or are proficient in one language, the societally hegemonic language. It's most often the case that these students are proficient in the societally dominant or hegemonic language and are learning two other, most often internationally useful languages. One of the models for doing this is called a world languages model, where language courses are offered in all three languages, say English, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese, which is the language allocation of the school where I did my research. But other subject matter, math, science, social studies, this is taught in English. And so there's limited opportunities to apply the language knowledge outside of language classrooms. Another model is an immersion model, which still includes language courses for all three languages, but academic subject matter is taught in those instructional target languages. So at the school where I did my research, which we'll talk about in a second, they used English, Spanish, and Mandarin as languages of instruction, and science and social studies were taught in Spanish as well as Spanish language arts. They used to teach math in Mandarin, but they moved away from that because of different difficulties. But an immersion model tries to teach content in the target languages as well. Finally, we have another common phenomenon where schools may describe themselves as trilingual or may be described by parents or staff as trilingual, but they're really what I kind of call a double track bilingual school, where they have two separate bilingual tracks where students can select one or the other. So maybe an English and Spanish bilingual track and an English and Mandarin bilingual track. These students aren't receiving instruction in all three languages, which is typically how trilingual education is described. Further, these tracks often, almost always, are paired with English. So English and Spanish, English and Mandarin. But what if there was a track of just Spanish and Mandarin? Those are other kinds of questions that arise from that. But these are three different models that are very much connected to global economics and geopolitical needs, as well as the needs of local communities of how do we best teach these three languages. So I now move, after setting a little bit of the stage of trilingual education models and what trilingual education can look like in the United States here in Arizona, I'll now move to discuss the study's equity-oriented theoretical framework, which is based around the concept of the kaleidoscope. So the kaleidoscope, for those of us who are maybe less familiar with a kaleidoscope, it's a tube that uses multiple lenses strategically placed at angles inside of the tube to produce a unique image when pointed at a light source. And this image was previously unimaginable and invisible to the naked eye before looking through the kaleidoscope. So the use of a kaleidoscopic theoretical framework with three interlocking lenses shown here provided me in my study with a more nuanced perspective of how different actors were involved in cultural phenomenon and linguistic kind of interactions at the school. So all three lenses rely on critical and equity-oriented theories, but the most important of the three lenses for our conversation today is the theory of ratiolinguistic ideologies. A ratiolinguistic perspective towards language ideologies powerfully shows how language and language use becomes racially marked and unmarked and is differentially perceived by what's termed the white listening subject. This can be a person, sometimes it can be even a test or a policy takes on this subject position of the white listening subject, which privileges standardized American English and the prestige multilingualism of white language users. So this critical theoretical perspective allows me to critique how education policies and policymakers can devalue or tokenize racialized people's language use and their languages themselves part of their identities, while white and English privileged language users are valorized and commended for using the same language forms. In constructing my kaleidoscope, I conjoined this critical theoretical lens of ratiolinguistic ideology with theories of social and cultural reproduction to interrogate the decision-making behind selecting English, Spanish, and Mandarin as languages of instruction for this trilingual immersion elementary school. This speaks to the importance of adjusting or attuning our theoretical frameworks as researchers to account for the dynamics and complexities of the research context. So this webinar is based on my dissertation study, which explored how an assemblage of factors, including education policies and societal discourses about race and language and class, shape how 3rd and 6th grade students, upper elementary teachers, school leaders, and school leaders at Desert Language Academy, a school I'll refer to as DLA, how do they experience and implement the Trilingual Immersion Charter School? I chose to investigate this school because trilingual education is very new in Arizona. It's a rather new trend in language education here in the US, outside, of course, of the studies with the Yaqui community and some other smaller studies here in the United States. There hasn't been a lot of research on trilingual education in the contemporary political climate that we're experiencing. This school is the first in Arizona to have students learn content in all 3 languages through an immersion model rather than 2 separate bilingual tracks. It's also a charter school, which we don't get into much in this presentation, but the competitive choice environment, I wanted to see how that influenced the school's creation and implementation and the experiences of different actors in this school. But we're focusing more on language ideology and language policy outcomes in this talk. So the study focuses on Desert Language Academy, which is a school in the large metropolitan city in Arizona called Cactus City. It's a pseudonym. And here we can see a GIS map that I've created of 44 K through 12 schools in this city with bilingual or multilingual programs. Most of the schools have opened in the eastern and northeastern parts of the county, which are predominantly white or Asian and English privileged. And we can see in this small area here, the area of Heavenly Hills, which is the suburb where Desert Language Academy is located. So we don't get much into school choice policy, but it creates a competitive environment in which bilingual schools have to augment themselves and market themselves to entice families to enroll and receive money to ensure that the doors stay open. Desert Language Academy is significantly shaped by this assemblage of education policies, and much of the study's findings highlight the impacts of choice at multiple levels. So it does influence language policymaking at multiple levels. Here's some indicators: socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, and sociolinguistic data from the US Census to kind of just showcase the affluence, the whiteness, English dominance in the suburb of Heavenly Hills where Desert Language Academy is located. The household income, household value, racial, ethnic demographics. These things skew much more towards white and English privileged and affluent communities, affluent families in Heavenly Hills. And so this study enriches the literature on the expropriation of bilingual education by really focusing on a school that's already set in an affluent community rather than kind of the narrative of a school in an urban community that targets and caters to predominantly racially and linguistically minoritized families, which then gets kind of taken over, for lack of a better word, by white and English privileged families. This school has always been in this white suburban neighborhood. how does that connect with the larger conversations about the expropriation of bilingual education? So at Desert Language Academy, the racial ethnic demographics largely mirror the neighborhood. The school is about 60% white. And according to the principal, approximately 95% are from English dominant or monolingual households. The year that I was working at the school from 2022 to 23, there were less than 5 EL designated students at the school who were mostly in the kindergarten, first and second grades. So only one of the students in my study who participated in my study was a former English learner, and he was the first English learner to enroll at Desert Language Academy, and I'll get into that a little bit later. This just shows some of the participants who contributed to data collection. For this webinar, we're focusing on findings from school documents that I reviewed, interviews with a student and with the school principal, and classroom observations. And this was a critical ethnographic case study of the trilingual elementary school. So I'm kind of framing the methodology and the epistemological kind of assumptions that I had about wanting to really learn from the participants, learning from students and teachers and school leaders about their experience at the school. I now move into discussing the pitfalls and promises of trilingual education as encountered in my study. So one of the pitfalls, the first pitfall, is that of prestige trilingualism and global citizenship. Prestige trilingualism prioritizes language learning for economic and geopolitical needs of nation states rather than the needs of racially and linguistically minoritized families and students. This infographic is posted all around Desert Language Academy to describe the core values summarized in the acronym PRIDE. Let's take a few seconds to look through the image on your own before we talk through it together, and you can share any of your thoughts or questions in the chat. So let's take maybe a few seconds to look through. And as we continue talking, you're welcome to put comments or thoughts in the chat as well, and that can help us foster some conversations later. Or if you have any questions or need me to speak more slowly or anything at all, please feel free to pop that in the chat. But this image, which was printed out, this is a picture of a laminated piece of paper that was taped to a door. It idealizes an imaginary student's language learning journey at Desert Language Academy. We start with P for purpose, which is up here on the right side of the image. The school's mission statement starts at the top, defines the school's purpose as developing students' knowledge and skills necessary to be productive citizens in a culturally diverse and global society, as well as preparing them for academic success. So this kind of language really reproduces the neoliberal connections between language learning and the production of some kind of value for the language learner, as well as for society or for the nation state. As the acronym begins with P, the first language shown beneath is English, which I interpret as idealizing English proficient or English privileged students for entry into the school, rather than students who may come in with multiple languages or languages other than English in their linguistic repertoire. It's important to note that DLA began as a private school for English privileged children to acquire Spanish and Mandarin Chinese. This has led the school to maintain a one-way world language orientation towards bilingual education that doesn't really account for the presence or needs of emergent bilingual students who are also learning English as an additional language. Hence, the idealized student who begins their language learning journey at DLA comes in with English first. They come in with some knowledge of English first. As your eyes move across the image, we move down the list of core values, including respect, integrity, determination. Desert Language Academy website lists inclusion rather than integrity as a core value, but in a type of Freudian slip, this term was, to my knowledge, unintentionally replaced here when the image was printed. The next language under integrity shown is Espanol, Spanish. Perhaps because, as many students and teachers shared with me, there's a belief that Spanish is easier to learn than Mandarin Chinese for English privileged students because of their similar characters and pronunciation. Following this ideology of linguistic transference, this may also indicate that the school expects students who are already imagined to be proficient in English when they arrive at DLA, they're imagined to more easily or successfully learn Spanish next before moving on to Chinese, a very monoglossic kind of progression through languages. However, the school isn't scaffolded this way. Starting in kindergarten, students learn all three languages throughout the course of the day. And the ratio of these languages of Spanish and Spanish and Chinese, is higher in the early grades. So it's interesting that they expect you to move from English neatly to Spanish. And then as we move further down, we come to Zhongwen or Mandarin Chinese. Finally, the pathway ends with becoming a global citizen, as shown by the globe. So we can imagine there's a progression from English to Spanish to Chinese. And at that point, because this language is placed closest to the globe, it may signal that this language, once Chinese is mastered to whatever degree is unclear, then you unlock the ability to access a global citizen identity. So it's kind of this imagined progression that helps to create a productive citizen in a culturally diverse and global society. And Mandarin is really imagined as the language that brings the global element into the school. No other languages are shown, which suggests to me that no other languages are deemed to be useful or necessary for this journey to global citizenship, which is anchored around three national, hegemonic, standardized, internationally useful languages. And this erases and double marginalizes students' minoritized heritage languages like Diné Bizad or Navajo, Cantonese, which we'll get into, Arabic, and also language varieties like Chicano Spanish. So overall, this infographic displays a lot of information. A lot of values are held in this graphic that, when interpreted through a critical and equity-oriented theoretical framework, it signals Desert Language Academy's values around the purpose and importance of trilingual education. And these purposes are primarily oriented towards the needs of English privileged students and families who want to learn Spanish and Mandarin as additional languages, perhaps informed by this neoliberal logic. And it also really caters to global capitalism, which requires flexible and mobile multilingual workers who don't see language as intrinsically connected to their identity or connected to broader struggles for social and educational justice. I'm going to move on to discuss another pitfall. And please always, if there's questions, comments, throw them in the chat. But another pitfall of trilingual education as shown in this context, right? I'm not generalizing to every trilingual education context that could exist, but as shown from this school, here are some of the pitfalls and promises. The next pitfall is the potential connection between trilingual education, academic rigor, and exclusivity. And it's very much this find us mentality where the principal articulates, if you're willing to commute to us, then we can take you. But they're also creating an image of the school is very rigorous. And this has been critiqued. This ideology of smartness has been critiqued as being very firmly rooted in the hegemonic social construct of whiteness. The idea that rigor and smartness are very much connected to whiteness and are also used like properties like whiteness, used as a type of property. So in addition to interrogating how whiteness and English privilege kind of come through in the infographic we just looked at, let's move to discuss how the school is marketed and described in a way that caters to local, affluent, white, English privileged families. Here, the principal shares what she would describe to a prospective parent who's interested in attending the school. So Principal Adams recognizes and navigates the legal requirements for charters to admit any student who can commute to the school. And she ends this statement, I can't tell you that you can't do it, right? I can't legally tell you to not come to the school. However, the hypothetical language that she uses when she describes talking with parents employs several what I call discursive scare tactics, perhaps to try and implicitly steer certain families away from enrolling if she doesn't think they're going to meet the strict requirements and rigorous expectations for success in the school. This includes beginning with you are at a disadvantage, explaining they're going to have to pay for extra assistance for homework club, outside tutoring, language learning apps, and also attending school organized field trips both to China and to Puerto Penasco or Rocky Point, Mexico, that many families go on in the spring, fall, and summer breaks. And Sarah connects these kinds of financial, linguistic, and familial supports or resources to student success at the school, and reinforces the idea that families with less financial means or more logistic challenges are inherently at a disadvantage at Desert Language Academy and should go elsewhere. Students with minoritized heritage languages who are not proficient in English are also subtly discouraged from attending this school because they're going to have to do so much extra studies and get extra tutoring. As my ethnographic data also shows, those who remain and those who push through this, who are emergent bilingual learners, are largely left to sink or swim. So another pitfall that's created is the associations of learning 3 languages with academic achievement and certain levels of rigor that excludes lots of other students who are deemed unsuitable for this kind of learning. In sum, we can consider several pitfalls in how trilingual education is currently formulated and implemented in Arizona schools. This includes Arizona's restrictive educational language policy, Proposition 203, which has limited access to these schools for English privileged students. Limited access to these schools for English privileged students and excluded English learners, as well as market-based education policies that have also shaped the creation and implementation of trilingual schools. So these factors, these different education policy factors, enormously impact actors' experiences around the school, and they shape language policymaking within classrooms and at the school level to prioritize English over Spanish, Mandarin, and other languages. The concept of neutrality in offering a trilingual education to all also has the potential to reproduce inequity by overlooking the specific needs that emergent multilingual learners bring into the school, especially those with racially and linguistically minoritized backgrounds or who have minoritized heritage languages. Finally, we see a hierarchy of languages and language users where English is positioned as the language of everywhere and everything, while the other languages are bounded based on content areas, geography, other functions. So these are some of the other pitfalls that I identified in my study, which there will be a lot more publication coming out. But in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we talk about some of the promises too, because there are positive things that came from the study. One of the last pitfalls, currently Superintendent Tom Hord is on a tirade to return to the 4-hour block, which was one approach for educating multilingual learners who were designated as English learners. If we go back to having a mandatory 4-hour block of English language development, English learners would have to leave trilingual schools, as well as most dual language bilingual schools, and go back to English monolingual learning, at least in those settings. So is very connected to current ongoing conversations and tensions around the future of English learners accessing these kinds of programs. But as I shared, I want to also discuss some of the promises of trilingual education, namely the ways that teachers and students agentively shape teaching and learning in their classrooms to align with counter-hegemonic principles that value language education for cultural heritage sustaining, for maintaining cultural heritages, and for expanding connections to family and community, right? So really pushing back on some of the larger trends that we've seen around expropriation. Much of this comes from translanguaging and relies on a translanguaging perspective. I'm sure that if we're part of the AZ-TESOL community, we've probably been exposed to translanguaging theory at some point. So I'm just going to briefly say that translanguaging views languages as fluid and dynamic, not distinct and bounded codes that are limited to use in different classrooms. The reason I say that is one of the chapters in the dissertation talks about Miss Contreras, the school's 3rd through 6th grade English language arts teacher, who is imagined to have an English-only classroom, but she brings in a very critically conscious perspective from her background growing up in Mexico and Texas and crossing the border as a transfronteriza student. And so she brings in a much more plurilingual kind of approach to her teaching. So here we see an interaction with Miss Contreras and Zoe, a Chinese student who has Mandarin and Cantonese as her family's heritage languages. And in this English imagined space, Miss Contreras says, Zoe, cierra la puerta, asks her in Spanish to close the door. And then when Zoe does it, she says, xie xie Zoe, thanking her in Mandarin. So bringing Spanish, Mandarin, and English all together into the milieu of her classroom. Additionally, while substituting for the Chinese teacher one day, she used Spanish to ask a question to a student, and another student tried policing her language, saying, I thought this was Chinese class, not Spanish. And Ms. Contreras' response really modeled her plurilingual perspective, which she says it's both, everything, implying that all languages have a space and are welcome in her classroom. So teachers really can agentively push back and make their classrooms more plurilingual, translingual spaces than schools may imagine. I also connect Ms. Contreras' story and her translanguaging pedagogy with Teresa, a 6th grade Navajo girl who was born and raised on the Navajo reservation in what's now called northeastern Arizona. Teresa was by far the quietest and most overlooked student who participated in the study based on months of detailed ethnographic observations, but the way that Ms. Contreras' pedagogy was able to engage with Teresa and allow her to bring Navajo into the classroom is something that I'll never forget. So here's a few quotes that we can take a second to look over. Just in the interest of time and not reading them all, but these quotes share some of Teresa's experiences in terms of coming to Cactus City from living on the Navajo reservation, being forced to start attending the trilingual school, and basically saying that within the last year and a half or 2 years of going to this trilingual school for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, that she says she's completely forgotten how to speak Navajo, and is really struggling with communicating with family members and feeling a sense of cultural identity since she's not really been encouraged as much in school to put effort into learning that language. So, So in August 2022, early into my time at Desert Language Academy, Ms. Contreras had a journal entry about mixing languages. She said, do you mix 2 or more languages? How does it feel to make you mix 2 or more languages? And we can see here in Teresa's written response, something I go into more depth in the chapter, is that Teresa used this as an opportunity to practice her Dene Bazad writing, as well as a chance to demonstrate her knowledge of the languages by mixing them together. So ya'ate means hello, how are you? And so she kind of bridges these 2 phrases in Navajo and in English to say, hello, how are you doing? There's a lot more in here in terms of like her ideologies about mixing languages and about the ways that being a Native American woman means that she must know her language. Since I am Native American, I kind of know how to speak my language. Um, but this is an example of how Ms. Contreras partners with racialized and linguistically minoritized students like Teresa, her cousin, Zoe, other students to transgress the school's rigid and idealized model of trilingualism in standardized forms of English, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. And that's what kind of influenced the title, Three Languages, right? Three instructional languages. But when you really look under the cover, you see that there's many multilingualisms, many different languages and language assemblages kind of present in the school. And Miss Contreras really embraced that and built on that. So that's one of the main promises that I wanted to highlight. So kind of discussing some of the conclusions, though I discussed more, I think a little more time focusing on the pitfalls of trilingual education, which largely comes down to the education policy context and the neoliberal kind of political climate in Arizona and in the US. Hopefully, we can chart a more promising path forward by looking at the ways that critically conscious teachers like Ms. Contreras really enact their agency to make their classrooms into welcoming spaces. Because even if you can't control what happens outside of your classroom, teachers have a lot more agency in kind of creating those spaces in their rooms. So, two of the promises of trilingual education are that one, more languages can bring together more communities, and I'll talk about that very briefly. And also, as we saw, teachers and students enact their agency to create meaningful language education opportunities. So, if we can try and consider how to design our programs around some of these promises and also to account for the pitfalls, I think we can create more culturally sustaining trilingual education programs, models, policies in Arizona and abroad. So more languages can bring together more communities. That means we're going to need new lingo, new program designations. So we have two-way immersion, which is very common here in Arizona and in other states, but it doesn't really get at the linguistic diversity that we find in this context. So we could call this three-way immersion with English, Spanish, and Mandarin. But still, that overlooks Teresa, that overlooks Zoe, that overlooks so many other students and teachers who have different, either different heritage languages or different ways of languaging that this model doesn't quite touch on. So we could potentially have a multilingual immersion model where we recognize more actively the languages and the resources that students bring in to not just say that we're looking at two groups or three groups, but multiple groups. But this still doesn't quite get at the, oh, there we go, at the complexity of language learning. So maybe we could use something like multi-directional translingual immersion. Maybe that gets more at the multiple directions, the translingual nature of language learning, but that doesn't really roll off the tongue, and that's hard to institutionalize when you're trying to create programs and create policies. So part of this is how do we create new lingo, new program designations, new terminology that really more accurately encapsulate what we're doing in schools when we kind of push the bilingual model to trilingual education and have three languages. So we'll kind of skip over teacher and student agency. Thank you very much for your attention. I know that in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we can have some question and answer, but these slides will be available, the recording will be available. Please reach out to me with any questions. And you can always stay tuned for upcoming publications. I'm really trying to push to get a lot of this published so that we can start having conversations with teachers and school leaders and parents and policymakers about how to address the questions around trilingual education. So thank you very much.
Now everyone, so now the floor is open for the questions. If you have questions, so I can see a question from Francesca. Um,
Yeah, I can ask the question. Corey, thank you so much. This was fascinating. So, I felt like, I don't, it doesn't sound like you had any access, you didn't have interviews with parents of the students, but did you get a feeling that the languages in this school were put in a hierarchy? Because I felt like the poster demonstrated that, right? It was placing value of each language just in that diagram or that visual that you showed. Did you get a feeling that the parents did that as well, placed each language in that manner?
Yeah, so the study was designed where I was when I consented all of the students, the parents also agreed to participate in an interview, but I only ended up actually getting a hold of three or four parents, just emailing them and calling them. And so in the dissertation, I wasn't able to include that really as a sample, but from the conversations I had, the interviews and informal conversations, a lot of the parents at the school were predominantly white or the families were multiracial. A lot of the parents shared a view that I heard more from the students that kind of separated the three languages into very different functions or domains. So um, Mandarin was very much connected to global economics and having like elite business or elite political kinds of careers, maybe being an ambassador, being a businessman working with China or working internationally. And so Chinese was kind of the linchpin that made the school global and really brought that kind of elite connotation. Spanish was seen as much more, well, we're here in the Southwest. We have lots of Spanish speakers in our community. We're close to Mexico, or we have a home in Mexico, was shared often, or we travel to Spain. So they need to know the language for interacting with Spanish speakers here in Arizona or abroad. And so it didn't have I mean, from students, I never recalled any of them connecting Spanish to jobs. One student, I think, said that she would use it as a doctor, but it was all languages, not only Spanish. So Spanish was much more about, um, for lack of a better word, like restaurant Spanish or some of those kind of more tokenizing like flattened kind of uses. But then English was everywhere, everything. There was no question of why we would learn English or why English is valuable. So it was really kind of like comparing the uses of Spanish and Chinese. Um, and a lot of the parents that I spoke with really hammered home the idea that Chinese was for geopolitical kind of stability for the US and also about business. But yeah, that's something I wish I had been able to dive into more with them.
Yeah, thank you for your response. You referenced Ophelia Garcia, and I read an article about hers a few years ago where she, in quotation, identified the Spanish language as a language of oppression. That's how we were viewing Spanish, and that broke my heart. It broke my heart, but I think it's definitely something that is happening not only in Arizona, but around our country. So I'm grateful that you brought all this to light. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I guess I would say that for families who have heritage connections to those partner languages, that it could be different in terms of communicating with their parents who might still be in Mexico or um, following the Chinese holidays and knowing the language as part of that or being Chinese and so that's part of the identity but because most of the parents and families didn't have heritage language connections especially with Chinese I think it was much more that like neoliberal kind of perspective.
and there's one more question from Lakshmi. I can read that for you. So thank you for
Sure.
the wonderful presentation. So I was curious to know what ways teachers' personal beliefs and practices about multilingualism influence the implementation of the trilingual model, and how were these aligned or in tension with official school policies?
Sure, awesome. Hi Lakshmi, thanks for joining. So one of the teachers that I talked more about here, Miss Contreras, was raised as a transfronteriza student. So she lived in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and traveled into El Paso, Texas every day for school, and experienced a lot of not only racism, but linguicism towards her use of Spanish in English monolingual, primarily Catholic schools. And one of the things she shared that she felt she had to leave her brownness at the door. That's one of the quotes that like will always kind of stick with me. And so I think her experiences of feeling, the linguistic insecurity and violence and growing up, as well as at the school, because some of the other Spanish teachers would devalue her Spanish as too Americanized, which is partially why she chose to be an English language arts teacher instead of a Spanish teacher. She had the most noticeably, she modeled translanguaging. She had a very plurilingual kind of perspective, very embracing students' cultural kind of backgrounds, not from like a tokenizing way, but really trying to empathize with them and find ways to get them more interested and engaged in class. And I think her use of multiple languages was part of that. So I noticed very quickly that her practices were very different from the school's official language allocation policy, which said that her class should be 100% English. And the principal affirmed that she's the English language arts teacher. She should be teaching in English, but her own kind of ideological clarity around that led her to have a different perspective, whereas the other teachers were much more aligned with the policy of policing students' use of other languages in their classrooms. So I guess I think the best way for me to answer your question is it really shows how, and all of the teachers were native speakers of their languages. So they were all from mainland China or from Mexico or Venezuela. And yet Miss Contreras had the most noticeably resistant kind of language policy in her classroom. I think because of those experiences of linguistic insecurity that she doesn't want to reproduce in her classroom. And other teachers, I don't think, experienced that in the same way growing up. So they didn't articulate as much of an issue with the language allocation policy. They kind of were more aligned with it. So the ways that their practices were kind of shaped by their experiences. I hope that answers your question.
And there is one more question from Elisa. So the question reads like this. I was wondering if you had an opportunity to share your results with the school, what the reaction was, if any changes were implemented as a result.
Yeah, it's a great question because it's something that I still struggle with. So I really tried to share not only my perspective and my like critical background that brings me to this work, not being kind of a values neutral researcher, but trying to share with them. I remember before the winter break, so about halfway through the study, here's some preliminary findings. English is the predominant language. The marketing is all in English, and it definitely caters to English privileged families. Just a couple really high level takeaways. And it wasn't necessarily like explicit pushback. It was just other than them being upset that I used the term eliteness for this very wealthy school, but eliteness. So other than explaining that, I think they just kind of wanted to let me do my thing and move on. And so any suggestions that I had for thinking about marketing the school or thinking about website, ways to discuss things or language policy was really just kind of overlooked. And at a certain point, I felt like the school was taking advantage of my emotional labor and my real labor because I was being a substitute and I was helping and I was doing a lot of stuff. And so I kind of realized that there's ways to make positive impacts from advocacy driven research without necessarily tying myself to the actual institution. So unfortunately, I don't think they've really engaged much with this and with the stuff I've shared. I continue to send them publications as they get released, but there's not a lot there, and that's my oversight as well as kind of larger trends. So yeah, that's a difficult one that if anyone, you know, for you who have done research and extended kind of ethnography or qualitative research, the ways of building that in sometimes can be challenging. So yeah, I hope that answers your question kind of.
I have put a question on the chat here. Like, did you get any impressions of how Tim Horn's return to English only immersion language policy impacted teachers and their teaching and the school teaching environment at the school as a whole?
The impacts of what was it? Of English language policy?
Like the Tim Horn's
Oh, of like Tom Horn. Yeah. Okay. So that was all coming out as I started this study. And so one of the questions that I added to the interview protocol kind of later when I was interviewing the school leaders later in the fall was, what are your perceptions of Tom Horn's, you know, push for the 4-hour block? And they said, huh? Who? They knew who Tom Horn was, but because this school is so focused on English privileged students, and before 2021, when the recent kind of shift happened with Proposition 203, they didn't have any English learners for most of the school's existence. And now that number is starting to trickle up because they're allowed to enroll. But it was such a like issue for the school leadership because it just wasn't on their radar, which also kind of signals the not really being super concerned about equity and access for English learner designated students. Because I said, if this lawsuit goes through, or if they find a way to reverse the 2020, the SB 1014, then all these students are going to have to leave your school. And that kind of concerned them because they would lose enrollment funding. But it was really surprising how few teachers, administrators, and parents knew about what's happening at the state level.
Do you have any more questions? I think we don't have. We are a little over a minute for our presentation. So, Francesca, do you have
Yeah,
any?
if
Yeah. So thank you for a great presentation.
there's any other questions, feel free to email me or you know, reach out on LinkedIn or anything. I'm always happy to chat about this, and stay tuned for upcoming publications. We've got some things moving, so hopefully we'll get this out to a wider audience soon. But thank you again all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Corey. Take care.
Thanks.
Okay, please join me in thanking Dr. Corey Bogban for delivering such a fantastic research, shedding light on the promises. I would say like promises, not the pitfalls. I mean, there are pitfalls, of course, but the promises of trilingual education in the Arizona school. Thank you once again. Thank you all for joining us. You know, from different parts of the country. I will say bye to
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you, Corey, once again.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Sure. Bye.
Bye.